Hey, what's going on, U.S. History people? This is Mr. Norris.
And Mr. Lawrence.
And we have part one for you today of the Regents exam review. This one is going to go from Colonial America all the way up to the Civil War. So let's get started, starting off with Colonial America through 1776.
All right, so colonies, British colonies specifically, right? That's what we're looking at.
13 of them.
That's right. And this is, as we know, hopefully by now, this is the outgrowth of the United States. And some basic things we need to know are kind of the two central colonies the British established. The first one is the Massachusetts Bay Colony that was established to be a model society. It was really led by a guy by the name of John Winthrop. He had a famous speech that he gave called City Upon a Hill. And it was to be the shining symbol or beacon for the rest of the world. So it was really focused on white landowning males, really church members who could vote, and women had very few rights in this early colony.
Absolutely, and we're going to contrast that and compare really with Virginia or Jamestown. And this was based on cash crops such as tobacco that would really help out the economy, but it exhausted the land. So people had to move further out west, which would lead to conflicts with Native Americans. And this is really going to be a theme throughout American history. As the U.S. expands, Native Americans are pushed further and further west.
So the number one thing to realize, going back to your global history days, colonies are really established in order to benefit the mother country. And the economic system was referred to as mercantilism. The purpose of colonies was to provide wealth for the mother country, whether it's through natural resources, through trade, whatever was necessary. Mercantilism really helped the mother country. And in this case, it was Great Britain.
All right, so let's talk about now the road to war. And it really begins in 1763 with the conclusion of the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. Now, this is not the French versus the Native Americans. On one side, we have the British and the colonists, and on the other, we have the French and the Native Americans. Now, the colonists and the British win, and the French are removed from North America. And this, without question, will drastically alter the relationship between the British and the colonists. The British will begin to take more of a hands-on approach. So we see 1763 as an important year, because we had the end of the French and Indian War, which leads to the end of salutary neglect. And remember, salutary neglect is when the British would pretty much leave the colonists alone as long as they were making money. Also that year, we have a conflict with Native Americans called Pontiac's Rebellion, and that led to a very important act passed by Britain called the Proclamation Line of 1763, which forbid expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Please write down now, right now, Appalachian Mountains next to Proclamation Line of 1763.
So hold on a second, Mr. Norris. You're telling me that the American colonists helped the British win this war, and now all of a sudden they're told that they can't move west past the Appalachians?
You are correct, and that's why it is going to drastically alter the relationship between the British and the colonists.
Interesting. So as this relationship starts to change, and you can see actually here, Mr. Norris provided us a nice map here, identifying the Proclamation Line of 1763 that runs along what mountain range?
The Appalachian Mountains. So if you did not write that down yet, what are you waiting for? Write it down right now.
All right. So as this relationship begins to change, we see more of an active role of Great Britain taking, really enforcing laws and having their say in the American colonies. And one example of this is the Stamp Act. And we know many of these issues that arise between the colonists and the British are focused on taxes. So the Stamp Act was to raise revenue for the British. The Stamp Act was an Congress, was the first attempt at colonial unity against the British. So trying to unite these colonies together to really go against the Stamp Act. And again, the British were trying to raise money to really support themselves after fighting the French and Indian War.
Yeah, and they'll do that with other acts as well, the Townshend Acts, the Intolerable Acts, and the Tea Acts. All of those were ways to raise money or revenue to pay off the debt from the French and Indian War. So again, that's why the relationship is going to be changed. Then we have this idea of no taxation without representation that you hear that the colonists are upset because they do not have representation in Parliament.
All right, so common sense. Here's my man T. Paine, or as we like to call him in history class, Thomas Paine, who urged colonists to break away from England. He stated that KG3. Who's KG3?
King George III.
He was a bad guy, and it was our common sense. It was our moral obligation, our duty to break away and really develop an independent nation. So he publishes what's called a pamphlet. It's spread throughout the colonies and really starts to get Americans thinking about independence.
Second most widespread book beyond the Bible read in the colonies during that time.
Interesting.
All right, so let's talk about the American Revolution. We're going to jump to the end of it, and the Treaty of Paris of 1783 will end this, and the U.S. gained all land east of the Mississippi River. So they're going to gain a huge amount of land. The first governing body of the first governing document of the United States was not the Constitution. It was the Articles of Confederation. This created a very weak central government. Federal government, by the way, central also means federal or national. So right now, write down either federal or national. And the federal government could not tax, they could not raise an army, and there was no executive branch because there was a fear of a person having too much power like the king.
All right, so everybody's happy, right? Because we have the Americans won the Revolution, we have the Articles of Confederation, everything's going great.
You would think so, but no.
You would think so, but no. All right, so this leads us to the next issue we have to be aware of is Shays' Rebellion. So this was a rebellion of Massachusetts farmers who showed that the strength of the new government was really lacking. Many Americans become concerned that because of local issues that might be arising over things like taxation or really any major issue could cause another rebellion and cause even more chaos within the now newly independent American nation. Something we also have to be aware of, though, part of the Articles of Confederation, one of the positives or strengths was the Northwest Land Ordinance of 1787. It outlawed slavery in these newly entered territories, which will eventually become states, as you can see, things like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. So this was a positive. It really provided an outline for new territories to become states. The goal was once you had gained 60,000 in population, you could apply to become a new state of the United States.
Mr. Lawrence, do you know what city this is right here?
Let me take a guess. Is that Washington? No, I'm kidding. That's Cincinnati. Right?
That is absolutely right. And that was the first, Ohio was the first state from there. It's because it's awesome. That's why.
That's what I've heard.
All right, so let's talk about the Constitutional Convention. As Mr. Lawrence just said, the Articles did not do very well. Oops, sorry about that. So the Constitutional Convention is held in Philadelphia, and there are a couple compromises that you absolutely positively know, if ands or buts about it, must know. First one is called the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, because it was a dude from Connecticut who created this. So it created a bicameral or a two-house legislature. This is going to be Congress. One house is based on population, that's the House of Representatives. The other one is based on equal representation, that is the Senate. And now the number one issue this settled was representation, or how each state would have representation in Congress.
So one issue that is going to follow us throughout much of the course as we study is the issue of slavery. And the founders had to deal with this right away. And what came up was the 3/5 compromise. The northern really supporters of the Constitution really didn't see slavery as a necessity. Obviously, we've been talking about Southern representatives saw it as a necessity for labor in the plantation South. So 3/5 of slave would count towards population for representation in the House. This was part of the compromise. Not a full slave would count towards representation, but 3/5 would count towards that.
So which area benefited from this?
I would say the South.
Absolutely, they did. They have more people counting towards representation.
So you're really counting people who have no rights whatsoever towards the census.
Correct.
Which gives them more power in Congress.
Absolutely. So not everybody's on board with the Constitution, so we have something called the Federalist Papers. And they are written by three people, John Jay, this dude Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. The purpose of this is to gain support for the ratification or the approval of the Constitution.
All right, so this starts that debate between our Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And not all Americans supported this new Constitution. They were considered our Anti-Federalists. And they kind of went to the Federalists and said, hey, you know what, guys? Maybe we will support this new Constitution, but we want some specific rights written out. And this will become the Bill of Rights, one of our, really another example of another compromise made by the founders. And what this did, added to the Constitution to appease the Anti-Federalists. Enough states will then ratify the Constitution with the passage of the Bill of Rights.
So it's important to know that in the original Constitution, there was no Bill of Rights. That was added after the Constitution was ratified.
That's why we call it the first 10
amendments or changes.
Very good.
All right, so let's talk about Alexander Hamilton, first Secretary of the Treasury. He has a financial plan, and the purpose was to improve the economy. So he calls for the creation of a Bank of the United States, or the BUS, and he also calls for tariffs, or a tax on imported goods, and excise taxes, or a tax on manufactured goods.
All right, so in 1791, we have a whiskey rebellion. Again, you see Americans not big fans of paying taxes, and an excise tax was placed on whiskey, almost like a sales tax. So what do farmers do? Well, farmers revolted, and they protested against the excise tax that was placed on by Alexander Hamilton. As a result, we see the Constitution, the new Constitution, put into action. The president at the time, George Washington, puts on his military uniform and marches out to meet these protesters, what they were called as rebels at the time, and put down this rebellion. It demonstrated the power of the new federal government under the Constitution, and that really a strong executive could react in times of crisis.
Yeah, so it's kind of the opposite of Shays' Rebellion, which lasted for a while because there was no strong central government. Under the Constitution, the Whiskey Rebellion is quickly crushed. All right, so Washington, he leaves after having 2 terms. He only serves for 2 terms, and he leaves and gives a farewell address. And in this, he warned against foreign alliances and political parties. So he's really going to help dictate American foreign policy for about 150 years in which they will remain neutral, not isolated, but neutral.
So following Washington as president, we have some more turmoil within the United States and fear because there's a lot of international problems as well. So Congress comes together and passes 2 laws, the Alien and Sedition Acts. And the purpose of these were that Federalists wanted to silence their opponents. So we're starting to see the growth of political parties. Many Democratic Republicans supported the French. Many Federalists supported the British. And the Alien Act made it more difficult for foreigners to become U.S. citizens. 5 to 14-year waiting requirement before you could actually gain citizenship.
So a lot of the people coming here during this time would be French who would support the Democratic Republicans. Now, the Sedition Act, we've seen a couple Sedition Acts throughout U.S. history. This makes it illegal to criticize the government. And in particular, this was meant to protect President Adams from criticism. Now, is this constitutional, Mr. Lawrence? Should it be?
Not, no.
No, but we don't have a Supreme Court yet that is able to declare laws unconstitutional. So we have a theory called the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions, written by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and they wanted to nullify or void the Alien and Sedition Acts.
All right, so as we continue to move through American history, we're going to get to a very important case of 1803, and this was probably the most significant case that we've studied in this course is Marbury versus Madison, which gives the Supreme Court the power that it has today. So the Supreme Court declared part of the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional. And this is very important, that phrase, unconstitutional. For the first time, the Supreme Court declared a law to be not aligned with the Constitution. So really, this is referred to as...
Judicial review.
Yes, judicial review. Please write this down, underline, circle it, start. Judicial review, the power of the Supreme Court to rule laws unconstitutional.
I can't believe I forgot to put judicial review in there. So write it down right now. We will check to see if you have judicial review. All right, same year, we have the Louisiana Purchase. It was purchased from France, and in reality, the U.S. only wanted the city of New Orleans because it was located on the Mississippi River in the Gulf of Mexico. And ultimately, France says you can have all of this area here in white, plus this little bit of green, if you purchase it. So Jefferson does, and he switches his interpretation of the Constitution from a strict to loose interpretation. So 2 things you absolutely must know. You have seen these on exams before.
Have to know it.
1, doubles the size of the U.S. 2, what does it do to his interpretation, Mr. Lawrence?
It flips it.
Flips it from strict to loose.
All right, so another conflict that we study after the American Revolution is the War of 1812. And for us as Western Yorkers, this was kind of the battlefront during this time period. So what were some causes of conflict between the United States and Great Britain, sometimes referred to as the Second War of Independence? Well, things like impressment. Mr. Norris, you remember what impressment was?
It's basically kidnapping of sailors and forcing them to join the British Navy.
Absolutely. And surprisingly, Americans were not very happy that the British were doing this.
Yeah.
The British were also arming Native Americans, which were causing a lot of problems for American settlers along the western frontier. And also we have war hawks. So there were people in the American government who wanted war against Great Britain. Again, the U.S. tried to gain Canada during this conflict, but it produced a hero, a very important war hero that we'll study more about, a guy by the name of Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans, which technically this battle happened when?
After the war ended. They just didn't get the news yet because there was no internet back then.
That's true. The Treaty of Ghent, is it?
Treaty of Ghent.
That's right. It was signed before this battle took place. But again, it took a little time to get information from Europe back to the Americas.
Signed on Christmas Eve, and this battle was fought on January 8th, so about 2 or 3 weeks later it was fought.
So as a result of this overwhelming victory by the Americans against the British, it helps to propel Andrew Jackson to the presidency in 1828.
All right, let's talk about the era of good feelings, which goes from 1816 to 1824, and this is really James Monroe's presidency, and here is James Monroe. We only have one political party, the Federalists ceased to exist, and we see a huge increase in nationalism during this time.
All right, so next we have what? All right, you do this.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was going to interrupt you, Mr. Lawrence. I'm sorry. So we have Henry Clay's American system, my boy Henry Clay. So he favored a couple things. One, another bus or Bank of the United States. Also internal improvements, things like roads, canals, railroads, etc., and a protective tariff, or a tariff on imported goods to encourage people to buy American goods.
All right, so has the issue of...
There's Henry. Look at him.
The young Henry.
That's a very young Henry, yeah.
All right, so as we continue through American history, has the issue of slavery gone away by the 1820s, 30s?
Not even close.
Not even close. So as more states are entered into the Union, this debate becomes even more difficult for American politicians. So they developed something called Missouri Compromise, a compromise on the issue of slavery. So the Missouri Compromise says when Missouri applied for statehood, it would upset the balance of free and slave states in the United States. Three parts of the compromise were as follows. Missouri would become a slave state. Maine would become a free state, and then at the 3630 latitude line, above would be free, and below would be slave. So Mr. Norris is showing us right here where the 3630 line is.
So, Mr. Lawrence, all this area in green up here, what would this be when they became states, according to the Missouri Compromise?
According to the Missouri Compromise, they would become free.
And these would become?
Slave.
Slave, there you go. All right, Monroe Doctrine. Everybody started the Monroe Doctrine. Very, very important. I'd be shocked if you didn't see this in some way, shape, or form. This was written by James Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who becomes the next president. And it basically tells Europe, you stay over there, we'll stay over here. So it divides the world into two. And it warned European countries to not recolonize Latin America. Last year in Global 2, you learned about people like Jose de San Martin and Simon Bolivar and these revolutions. Well, the European countries want those colonies back. And Monroe, or Uncle Sam, is saying, you stay over there, we'll stay over here. And in return, the U.S. would stay out of foreign affairs. And this is really going to be the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy for decades and decades to come.
So this is one of the first times the American government is kind of flexing its muscle on the world stage. Right?
Exactly, trying to.
National player. All right. So let's keep moving on to the Jackson era from 1824 to 1840. And it's important because Jackson was seen as what's referred to as the common man. So he increased voting rights for adult males, elimination of property requirements to vote. But was this all adult males?
No, just white adult males.
Right. But again, he is seen as the common man president, so trying to really appeal to the everyday American, not just the elite groups of American society.
In 1828, we have the Tariff of 1828, also known as the Tariff of Abominations. This was a very high tariff. It was disliked by the South and the West because they were not manufacturing any goods. And John C. Calhoun, wrote something called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, and he encouraged states to nullify the Tariff of Abominations. Basically, he's stealing a page from the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions.
So true or not true, this Tariff of Abominations could have led to an earlier Civil War.
Without question, true.
Which led to what's called is the Nullification Crisis, where South Carolina called for a state convention to nullify the Tariff of 1828, which would really violate the Supremacy Clause, saying that a federal law is supreme over any state action.
Yeah, states can't do that, but they tried anyway.
Absolutely.
All right, so Jackson and Native Americans. We have the Indian Removal Act, which was passed under his administration. And the purpose of this was to move natives west of the Mississippi. And in the famous court case, Worcester v. Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled that natives did not have to move. And as we saw in that video we watched this year, Jackson did not enforce the decision of the Supreme Court. He should have, and this led to the Trail of Tears.
Yeah, it was really, politically, it was the right thing for Jackson to do, but constitutionally, he violated the Constitution.
Absolutely.
All right, so continuing on, something extremely important. Please underline, star, circle, manifest destiny. It shows up all the time. So what is it? It was coined by a guy by the name of John Sullivan, America's God-given right to expand from coast to coast. So we would control all territory from the east in the Atlantic Ocean to the west in the Pacific. One example of this would be
the Mexican-American War. And during this war, we have Henry David Thoreau. He writes his influential writing on civil disobedience, and he refused to pay a poll tax that he believed would fund the war. Mr. Lawrence, who is this going to inspire later in life?
Eventually, Mahatma Gandhi, and then eventually
Martin Luther King.
That's right.
The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War, and the U.S. gained the Mexican cession, and they increased the amount of land by 1/3. So Manifest Destiny is virtually complete.
All right, so another compromise over the issue of slavery with more territory coming in under the American control is a compromise of 1850, which helped to settle dispute over the land gained from the Mexican-American War. The idea was to institute popular sovereignty, which means what?
The ability for people living in a territory to vote on the issue of slavery.
That's right, so people would actually vote in the Mexican Cession territory. A tough fugitive slave law was also passed, which turned many in the North towards the abolitionist side, saying that really bounty hunters could go into northern free states and really pretty much remove any African American back to the South and say that they were a runaway slave. It abolished the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and California would be admitted as a free state to balance in favor of free states within Congress.
And without question, the number one divisive issue of the Compromise of 1850 was the tough fugitive slave law. Many people in the North suddenly became abolitionists. The Gadsden Purchase was purchased. It's this little area in yellow, originally meant to build a railroad, and from that moment forward, the U.S. Continental Expansion is complete. So the boundaries we know today of the continental U.S. are done in 1852.
That's really Jimmy Fallon's favorite purchase, right?
Jimmy Fallon by far loved it.
All right, so the antebellum reform movements that we need to know, some key reform movements. So what is the antebellum era again, Mr. Rose? Can you remind us?
Prior to the Civil War.
All right, so some things we need to remember. One, abolitionist movement, which was to abolish slavery, really starts to develop during this time period. The temperance movement, again, to eliminate the overconsumption of alcohol. Tied into this was the women's rights movements, starting really with the Seneca Falls Convention that started with the issue of abolitionism, but eventually moves into other areas as well. Education reform, a guy by the name of Horace Mann, we're going to start to slowly see the growth of a more modern public school system, and also the treatment for the mentally ill. A lady by the name of Dorothea Dix will lead that reform movement as well. So many changes starting during this time period.
You want to know how I remember the education reform?
Tell me.
Man, do I love education.
That's good.
You can use that if you want.
I'll steal it.
All right, so let's talk about nativism, and we're going to talk about old immigration. Holy cow, do you have to know this slide. Very, very important. So nativism, we talked a lot about throughout the course. It is fear, distrust, and hatred of foreigners. So what are some reasons? Well, it'll be the same in the 1840s as it is in the 1920s or 2015. There are different cultures of immigrants, different languages, and religion as well. And Irish and Germans would be accused of stealing elections because they would consistently vote Democratic. And we'll see this at places like Tammany Hall in New York City, which we'll talk about in the next video. Sorry.
So the know-nothings? Well, I don't know because I know nothing. No, I'm just kidding. I know what it's about. So what is it? Well, it's a political party that was formed as a result of nativists. So this is where really nativists come together to push their ideas. One thing they wanted to do was ban Catholics from ever holding office in the United States. So again, a group of nativists come together, create a political party known as the Know-Nothing Party.
What was their problem with Catholics?
They felt that they were going to be aligned to the Pope and would not be aligned to American ideals.
Very good. All right, so let's talk about what exactly is old immigration. Well, they are immigrants that came from Northern and Western Europe, and specifically, you have to know these countries. It's mostly Ireland, because of the potato famine, Germany, and England. And it occurred from the 1820s to the Civil War, and the largest group by far was the Irish because of the potato famine.